If you had told me a year ago that my life would take this turn, that I would find myself standing in that doorway, frozen, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts, I would have laughed in your face. Because things like this, they happen in movies, in scandalous books, in whispers behind closed doors. Not in my life. Not in my family. And yet, here I am. I still remember the way my hands trembled. The way my stomach twisted into knots so tight, I thought I would throw up. It's been 6 months since that night, 6 months since my entire world was shattered into pieces I can never put back together. And the worst part? I didn't see it coming. Not even a little. I remember blinking, thinking, no, this can't be real. I must be imagining this. There has to be some explanation, right? But there wasn't. Because right there, in front of me, doing the last thing I ever thought I'd see, was my step-younger brother. And in that moment, every single thing I thought I knew about trust, about loyalty, about love, it all crumbled. I wish I could unsee it. God, how I wish I could unsee it. But I can't. And neither will you after hearing this story. But before I tell you everything, before I take you down this road with me, I need to know. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have turned around and walked away, pretending you saw nothing? Would you have confronted them right then and there, letting rage take over? Or would you have done what I did? Because the truth is, I didn't know what to do. My body was frozen, my mind spinning in 1,000 directions. And when I finally did react, I did something I never thought I was capable of. So before we go any further, before I take you into the moment that changed everything, I need you to do 2 things. First, hit that subscribe button. Because what I'm about to tell you is just one of the many true infidelity stories we uncover here on Shocking Infidelity Saga. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. And second, drop a comment below. Tell me, have you ever seen something you wish you could erase from your memory? Something that shook you so deeply, you still feel it like a ghost hovering over your shoulder? Because that's what this is. A ghost. A nightmare. A moment I will never escape. And now, it's time for you to see it too. I've been married for 8 years. 8 long years that started with love, laughter, and promises. Promises that, somewhere along the way, lost their meaning. It wasn't always like this. In the beginning, my husband looked at me like I was the only person in the world. He touched me with purpose, kissed me like he needed it to breathe. But time has a way of changing things. Slowly, the space between us grew. At first, it was just little things, missed date nights, conversations that felt more like checklists than real connection. Then came the excuses. Work, stress, exhaustion. I stopped asking. Stopped trying. I learned to live with the silence. The love didn't disappear all at once. It faded, day by day, until one morning I woke up and realized I was living with a stranger. Sharing a bed with someone who barely saw me. Speaking to a man who barely listened. I told myself it was normal. That every marriage went through phases. That if I just held on a little longer, things would go back to the way they were. But they never did. And then there was him. My step-younger brother. He was always around, slipping into conversations with that effortless charm, flashing that boyish grin that made everyone adore him. He was younger, full of life, always carrying this energy that made the air feel lighter. I never thought anything of it. I was just his older sister by marriage, someone he teased, someone he joked with. It was playful, innocent. At least, it was in the beginning. I don't know when things started to shift. Maybe it was the way he lingered a little longer in the kitchen when we talked. The way his eyes stayed on me, like he was seeing something no one else saw. Maybe it was the way his voice softened when he spoke my name. Or maybe it was me. Maybe it was the way I started noticing him. The way he laughed, the way he carried himself with confidence, the way he gave me attention I hadn't felt in years. The kind of attention that made me feel alive again. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was just reading too much into things. That I was lonely, and loneliness plays tricks on the mind. But deep down, I knew. And the worst part? I liked it. I liked the way his presence filled the empty spaces in my life. The way he listened when I spoke, actually listened. The way he looked at me, like I was someone again, not just a wife fading into the background of a marriage that had gone cold. And maybe, just maybe, that's why I didn't see the warning signs. Because I wanted to believe it was harmless. I needed to believe it was harmless. But what I saw that night proved me wrong. Because nothing about this was harmless. Nothing about this would ever be the same again. It happened during a weekend trip. A small family getaway, nothing extravagant, just a change of scenery. My husband suggested it last minute, almost like an obligation rather than something he truly wanted. I didn't argue. At that point, I had learned not to expect much from him. The house we rented sat by the water, tucked away from the noise of the city. It should have felt peaceful, but even in the silence, I felt the weight of everything unsaid. My husband was there, but not really. He spent most of the time on his phone, stepping away to take calls, barely acknowledging me unless it was necessary. And then there was him. My step-younger brother arrived a day later, dropping his bag in the corner, stretching out like he belonged there. He always had a way of making himself at home no matter where he was. Carefree. Effortless. Alive in a way I hadn't been in years. We didn't talk much that first day. Just the usual, small talk, light teasing. But something felt different. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered when I spoke, or the way his voice carried an undertone I couldn't quite place. That night, we sat outside on the deck. The moon was high, the air cool, the waves soft against the shore. My husband had already gone to bed, an early meeting the next morning, or at least that's what he said. It was just the two of us. We talked about everything and nothing. The kind of conversation that stretches on without feeling forced. And then, at some point, there was a pause. A silence that felt too quiet. I looked up, and he was already watching me. He said my name just once, but there was something about the way he said it. Like it meant more than just my name. Like he had been waiting for the right moment to say it that way. I should have looked away. I should have laughed it off, changed the subject, walked inside. But I didn't. I held his gaze for a second too long. Just long enough to feel something shift between us. A breath. A moment. A tension so thick it almost felt tangible. And then, just as quickly as it came, I broke it. I mumbled something about being tired, about heading inside. He didn't stop me, but I could still feel his eyes on me as I walked away. My heart was pounding. Not because anything had happened, but because for the first time, I realized something could. And that scared me more than anything. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the moment on the deck, the way he said my name, the weight of his gaze, the pause that lingered too long. Did I imagine it? Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was reading too much into things. I turned over, glancing at my husband beside me. He was already deep in sleep, his back to me, just like every other night. He hadn't even noticed I stayed outside longer than usual. Hadn't asked if something was on my mind. Hadn't cared. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts restless. He's just being friendly. I'm overthinking this. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I felt it. That moment wasn't like the others. It wasn't just laughter and teasing. Something changed. And the worst part? I didn't want to stop thinking about it. I should have felt guilty. I should have been disgusted with myself. But I wasn't. I was excited. Not because of what happened, but because of what could have happened. That realization hit me like a wave, stealing the air from my lungs. How long had I been starving for something I couldn't even name? How long had I been waiting for someone to make me feel again? I turned to look at my husband once more. Nothing. No movement. No warmth. No sign that he had even noticed how distant we had become. He used to see me. Really see me. But somewhere along the way, I had become just another part of his life. A fixture. A convenience. Something he assumed would always be there, no matter how much he neglected it. Neglected me. I thought about the way my step-younger brother looked at me. Not just as someone's wife. Not as an obligation or an afterthought. As a woman. It was harmless, right? It had to be. But if it was, why couldn't I shake the feeling in my chest? The one that made my pulse quicken, my skin warm, my breath come a little faster? Why did it feel like a door had been opened, one I wasn't sure I wanted to close? I rolled onto my back and stared at the ceiling again, my heart heavy with something I couldn't quite name. Excitement, fear, guilt, desire, and worst of all, hope. The next morning, I told myself everything was fine, that nothing had changed, that I could shake off the thoughts from the night before and carry on like normal. But the moment I stepped into the kitchen and saw him, I knew I was lying to myself. He was standing by the counter, pouring a cup of coffee, the morning sunlight catching in his hair. He looked up when I entered, his eyes meeting mine for just a second too long. And in that second, I felt everything all over again. I hesitated, just for a moment, then forced a smile. Act normal. Be normal. Morning, I said. His lips twitched like he was holding back a smirk. Morning. I could hear my husband in the other room, talking on the phone, already immersed in something more important than this moment. And then, just as I reached for a cup, his hand brushed mine. It was nothing, just a brief touch, but my skin burned where his fingers had been. I snatched my hand away, my heart pounding. He didn't say anything, didn't acknowledge it, just took a slow sip of his coffee. But the look in his eyes told me everything. He felt it too. As the day went on, I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into nothing. But then there were the glances, the pauses in conversation that stretched just a little too long. And then, that evening, it happened again. We were all sitting around after dinner, the wine flowing, the mood lighter than it had been in days. My husband had stepped outside to take yet another call, leaving just the two of us in the living room. And somehow, we ended up playing a stupid game. Truth or dare. It started out harmless. Silly questions, easy dares. But then he looked at me, his eyes dark with something unreadable, and asked, "Have you ever wanted something you knew you shouldn't?" My breath caught in my throat. He knew what he was doing. I could feel the tension thick between us, stretching across the space that suddenly felt too small. I could hear my husband's muffled voice outside, completely unaware of what was happening right here, just a few feet away. I should have laughed it off. Should have rolled my eyes, thrown the question back at him. But instead, I swallowed hard, held his gaze, and said, "Yes." A slow smile spread across his lips. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The air between us had already shifted. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't nothing anymore. This was something. Something dangerous. Something I should have stopped. But deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to. That night, the house was silent. The kind of silence that hums in your ears, thick and heavy. I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying the way he looked at me, the way his question hung between us, unanswered but understood. I thought about the way my pulse had quickened, the way my skin had warmed, the way I had felt alive for the first time in years. And I hated myself for it. I shouldn't have let it go this far. I shouldn't have entertained the way my body responded to him, the way my thoughts lingered on him longer than they should have. But knowing that didn't change the fact that it had happened. That it was still happening. I sat up, staring at the shadows stretching across the ceiling, my chest tight with something I couldn't name. I needed air. I slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake my husband. Not that it mattered. He was fast asleep, as oblivious as ever. I moved through the dark hallway, my bare feet silent against the cool floor. The house felt different at night. Bigger. Emptier. And then, just as I was passing by one of the rooms, I heard it. A sound. Soft. Muffled. I froze. It came again. A hushed whisper. A quiet, breathy exhale. I felt my pulse quicken, my stomach tightening. I shouldn't look. I shouldn't look. But my hand was already reaching for the door. I pushed it open just enough to see inside. And what I saw made my blood turn to ice. There he was. My step-younger brother. But he wasn't alone. There was someone with him. And in that moment, everything inside me shattered. My chest ached, my throat went dry, my fingers curled into my palms as I struggled to breathe. What am I looking at? My mind refused to process it. My heart screamed at me to turn away, to pretend I had never seen it. But I couldn't, because the worst part wasn't who he was with. The worst part was the way he touched them. The way he looked at them. The same way he had looked at me. It hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the breath from my lungs. Had I been imagining everything? Had I been foolish enough to believe I was the only one feeling this? I wanted to step back, to run, to disappear before he noticed me standing there. But then, he looked up. Our eyes met. And in that split second, I saw it. Not shock. Not guilt. Something else. Something that made my skin prickle, my stomach turn. Something that told me that whatever I thought I knew, whatever I thought was happening between us, I had been wrong. So very, very wrong. I stood there, frozen. My breath caught in my throat, my body rigid, my mind racing. He had seen me. I knew that for sure. His eyes locked onto mine, steady, unblinking. No panic. No shame. No rush to explain or hide what he was doing. And that was what made my stomach churn. Because if he wasn't surprised, if he wasn't ashamed, then what had this been? What had we been? I felt sick. I should have turned away. Should have slammed the door, run back to my room, woken up my husband and told him everything. But I didn't. I couldn't move. I wanted to believe that there was some explanation, some rational reason why I was standing here, watching my step-younger brother in the middle of something I was never supposed to see. But there wasn't. The truth was staring me in the face, sharp and undeniable. This wasn't just about what he was doing. It was about me. Because up until this very moment, I had let myself believe that what had been happening between us, the glances, the touches, the words left unsaid, meant something. That I meant something. But now, standing in that doorway, I saw it for what it was. It was never just me. I felt a deep, sinking weight settle in my stomach. How could I have been so blind? How could I have let myself get pulled into something that was never real to begin with? I had let myself want this. I had let myself believe in something that had only existed in my own mind. And now, I was drowning in it. I wanted him to say something. Anything. To explain. To deny. To make this all make sense. But he didn't. He just held my gaze for a moment longer. And then, he smirked. Something inside me cracked. Because in that moment, I understood. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some careless mistake. This was intentional. He wanted me to see. And suddenly, everything, the way he had looked at me, the way he had spoken, the way he had made me feel, felt like a cruel joke. Like I had been led to the edge of something dangerous, only to be shoved over it. I felt my fingers tremble as I stepped back. My chest was tight, my breath shallow. I needed to get out of there. So I did. I turned. I walked away. And as I did, I heard something behind me. Not an apology. Not an explanation. A low chuckle. Like he had won. Like this, whatever this was, had been a game. And I was just another piece on his board. I locked myself in the bathroom, gripping the edges of the sink, staring at my own reflection like I was looking at a stranger. My chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, my pulse still erratic from what I had just seen. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. I wanted to erase the last few minutes from my mind, to go back to before, to when I still believed in the lie I had told myself. But I couldn't, because now there was no running from it. No pretending. I had let myself get too close to the edge, and now I was standing on the other side, looking back at the wreckage. What did this mean? For me? For my marriage? For the last 8 years, I had lived in the shadow of my husband's absence. A wife in title only, a ghost in my own home. I had convinced myself that the loneliness, the neglect, the feeling of being invisible, none of it was enough to break me. But it had, because I had reached for someone that wasn't mine to have. And I wasn't even sure if I had ever had him to begin with. Was it real? Had any of it been real? I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my fingertips into my temples. I had felt it. I knew I had. The tension, the way he looked at me, the way my body responded before my mind could stop it, none of that was imagined. But now, after what I had just seen, I had to ask myself a question I never thought I would have to. Had I really been falling into something? Or had I been falling for something? I felt sick. Because if it had all been a game to him, if I had been nothing more than a momentary amusement, Then what did that say about me? About how desperate I had been to feel seen. I gripped the sink tighter. I had been seeking something. Attention, validation, warmth. And in the process, I had almost lost myself. And now, I had a choice to make. If I told my husband, if I let him in on the truth, on everything, what would happen? Would he even care? Or would this just be another inconvenience to brush aside? I didn't know what scared me more, the idea of destroying what was left of our marriage, or the possibility that it had already been destroyed a long time ago, and I was the only one who hadn't realized it yet. And if I stayed silent? If I swallowed this whole, buried it deep inside me, pretended it never happened, could I live with that? Could I go back to the way things were, knowing what I knew now? Knowing that I had let myself believe in something that was never real? I leaned against the counter, exhaling shakily. Maybe this was my punishment. For stepping too close to something forbidden. For mistaking attention for affection. For searching for love in the wrong place. And now I had to live with the weight of it. Alone. I don't know if I'll ever forget that night. I don't know if I'll ever forget the way my stomach twisted when I saw him, the way my breath caught in my throat, the way everything I had convinced myself was real suddenly shattered right in front of me. I had been searching for something, maybe love, maybe validation, maybe just something to remind me I was still alive. But what I found instead was a truth I wasn't ready for. Now, I have to ask you, what would you have done? If you were in my position, if you had let yourself slip too close to something dangerous, only to realize it wasn't what you thought it was, would you tell the truth? Would you walk away like it never happened? Or would you do something you might regret? Have you ever seen something you wish you could erase? Something that changed the way you saw someone forever? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga, and turn on notifications. Because this story, it isn't over. Not for me. And if you want to know what happened next, let me know. Because sometimes, the most dangerous temptations don't come from strangers. They come from the people we trust the most. And if you're not careful, you might find yourself lost in something you can't escape.